In 1973, Britain produced nearly 28 million tons of steel, placing it among the most powerful industrial economies in the world. More than 310,000 workers were employed across vast, furnace-driven complexes stretching from Sheffield to Scunthorpe and Port Talbot, regions where, in some cases, over half the population depended directly or indirectly on steel for survival. This was not just an industry, it was the structural core of a nation that had built its empire on iron and fire, supplying warships, railways, machinery, and infrastructure that shaped global trade and military dominance. But within less than a decade, that foundation began to fracture. By the early 1980s, British steel was losing the equivalent of over £1 billion a year as global demand weakened and cheaper, more efficient foreign producers overtook the market. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a systematic dismantling, marked by mass layoffs, shrinking production, and the closure of entire industrial regions. By the 1990s, the workforce had fallen below 50,000, and in 1992 the shutdown of Ravenscraig, once one of Europe's largest steelworks, marked the symbolic end of Britain's industrial dominance. This was not an accident, and it was not inevitable. It was the result of decades of decisions made in a world that was changing faster than Britain's most critical industry could adapt. What once stood as the backbone of a global empire did not collapse overnight. It eroded quietly until the system that built modern Britain could no longer sustain itself. If you like Britain's industrial era and the rise and fall of powerful companies, consider subscribing. Now, let's go back to where this story begins. Chapter 1. The Industrial Origin. Rise begins. Long before Britain became a global superpower, its strength was already being shaped beneath the ground. Vast reserves of coal and iron ore, two of the most critical raw materials in industrial production, were concentrated across regions like South Wales, Yorkshire, and the Midlands. This geographical advantage would prove decisive. Because in the late 18th century, as the Industrial Revolution began to transform economies, Britain was not just participating in that change, it was leading it. Coal-powered steam engines, iron formed the structure of machines, and together they created a new industrial system that no longer depended on manual labor alone. What began as scattered workshops and small foundries quickly evolved into large-scale production, and at the center of that transformation was a material that would redefine industrial power: steel. The breakthrough came in the mid-19th century with the introduction of the Bessemer process, a method that allowed molten iron to be converted into steel quickly and at a fraction of the previous cost. Before this, steel had been expensive and limited in use, reserved for specialized tools and small-scale applications. But now, for the first time, it could be produced in large volumes. This shift did not just improve production, it unlocked entirely new possibilities. Railways expanded rapidly, connecting industrial centers with ports and cities, while steel tracks replaced iron, allowing heavier loads and faster transport. At the same time, shipbuilding entered a new phase as wooden vessels gave way to iron and steel hulls capable of supporting global trade and naval expansion. Britain was no longer just producing goods, it was building the infrastructure of a global industrial system. No city represented this transformation more clearly than Sheffield. By the late 19th century, it had become one of the world's most important centers of steel production, known for both scale and quality. Its factories produced everything from precision tools to heavy industrial steel, supplying markets across Europe and beyond. But Sheffield was only one part of a broader network. Across Britain, regional steel hubs developed their own specializations, supported by local resources and skilled labor. These were not isolated operations. They were interconnected systems that formed the backbone of industrial growth. Private firms, often family-owned or regionally controlled, competed while collectively expanding national output. Steel was no longer just a material. It had become a driver of economic expansion. As the British Empire expanded, so did the demand for steel. Railways stretched across colonies, ports were constructed to handle increasing volumes of trade, and infrastructure projects scaled rapidly to support global movement of goods and resources. Steel reinforced bridges, powered locomotives, and strengthened naval fleets that protected trade routes. Its role was not symbolic, it was structural. The ability to produce steel at scale allowed Britain to build, connect, and maintain a global system of economic and political influence. By the early 20th century, this industrial capacity had taken on an even greater significance. During the First and Second World Wars, steel became a strategic necessity. Weapons, vehicles, ships, and infrastructure all depended on continuous production. Factories operated at maximum capacity, and the link between industrial output and national survival became undeniable. The wars did not create the importance of steel, but they exposed just how critical it had become. Nations that could produce more steel could sustain longer conflicts and maintain a decisive advantage. By the end of World War II, Britain's steel industry stood as one of the central pillars of its economy. It had powered industrial growth, supported military strength, and shaped the physical structure of modern Britain. But beneath that strength, underlying issues were beginning to emerge. Much of the infrastructure had aged under the pressure of continuous production, and while output remained high, efficiency varied across regions. At the same time, global competition was beginning to take shape as other countries rebuilt their industries using newer technologies and more efficient systems. Despite these challenges, the structure of the British steel industry remained largely fragmented. A network of private firms continued to operate with varying levels of productivity, making coordination difficult at a national scale. What had once been a source of flexibility was now becoming a limitation. The demands of the modern industrial world were changing. Scale alone was no longer enough. Efficiency, coordination, and long-term planning were becoming increasingly important. Steel had reached a point where its importance extended beyond economics. It was central to infrastructure, essential to industry, and critical to national security. The system that supported it, however, was no longer aligned with the demands of a rapidly evolving global market. And as these pressures grew, a fundamental question began to emerge. Could an industry of this scale and importance continue to operate as a fragmented network of private firms? Because by the mid-20th century, it had become clear that steel was no longer just another industry. It was the foundation on which everything else depended. And if that foundation weakened, the consequences would extend far beyond factories and production lines. The industry had reached a point where its importance outweighed the system that controlled it. And that is when the government made a decision that would redefine its future. This was no longer an industry that could be left entirely in private hands. Chapter 2. Nationalization and Scale. The 1967 Turning Point. By the mid-1960s, it had become increasingly clear that Britain's steel industry, despite its historical strength, was no longer operating as a unified system. What existed instead was a fragmented network of more than 200 private companies, each with its own processes, priorities, and levels of efficiency. Some plants were modern, others outdated, and coordination across the industry was limited. At a time when global competitors were building integrated and highly efficient production systems, Britain was still relying on a structure shaped by decades of independent ownership. The industry that had once driven industrial leadership was now struggling to keep pace with a changing global standard. In 1967, the British government made a decisive intervention. Under the leadership of Tony Benn, the majority of the steel industry was nationalized and consolidated into a single entity, the British Steel Corporation. More than 200 companies were brought together under state control, forming one of the largest industrial organizations in the country. The objective was clear: eliminate duplication, coordinate investment, and create a system capable of competing at an international level. Steel was no longer viewed simply as an economic sector. It was treated as a strategic national asset, essential for both industrial stability and long-term growth. This marked a fundamental shift in how the industry operated. Instead of competing firms working independently, production was now organized as a single coordinated system. Resources could be directed where they were most needed, modernization could be planned at a national level, and production could be aligned with broader economic priorities. The aim was not just to increase output, but to create a more efficient and structured industry capable of sustaining Britain's position in the global market. At the center of this transformation were a series of large-scale industrial complexes that would define the new era of British steel. Plants such as Port Talbot in South Wales, Scunthorpe in England, Teesside in the northeast, and Ravenscraig in Scotland became the core of production. These were vast, integrated facilities designed to operate at high capacity, each capable of producing millions of tons of steel annually. They were not simply factories, but entire industrial systems, combining raw material processing, production, and distribution within a single coordinated structure. The strategy was to concentrate output in fewer, larger, and more efficient sites, while gradually reducing reliance on smaller, less productive plants. The workforce expanded significantly within this model. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, employment within the British Steel Corporation reached between 250,000 and 300,000 workers, making it one of the largest employers in the country. Entire regions became economically tied to these major plants, with local economies structured around the stability of steel production. For many workers, nationalization brought a sense of security. The industry was no longer dependent on the financial health of individual firms. It was backed by the state, integrated into national policy, and positioned as a long-term foundation of the economy. For a time, this approach appeared effective. Production remained strong, key facilities were modernized, and the industry maintained its position among the leading steel producers globally. The scale and integration of the system gave it a presence that few competitors could match, and its alignment with government policy ensured continued support during periods of uncertainty. Steel continued to supply critical sectors such as construction, automotive manufacturing, and infrastructure, reinforcing its role within the broader economy. However, beneath this apparent strength, structural challenges were beginning to take shape. The same scale that allowed for coordination also introduced complexity. Decision-making became slower as multiple layers of management and government oversight influenced how and when changes could be implemented. Investment decisions, while large in scope, did not always match the pace required to keep up with technological advancements in other countries. The system was designed for stability, but not necessarily for speed. At the same time, global competition was evolving. Countries such as Japan and West Germany, rebuilding their industries after World War II, were constructing modern plants from the ground up. These facilities were designed with efficiency in mind. Optimized layouts, advanced technologies, and production methods that reduced costs while increasing output. Unlike Britain, which was adapting existing infrastructure, these competitors were building systems without legacy constraints. The difference was not immediately visible in total output, but it was becoming increasingly significant in terms of efficiency and cost. Within the British Steel Corporation, there was a continued belief that size and coordination would be enough to maintain competitiveness. But this assumption overlooked a critical factor. Efficiency was not determined by scale alone. It depended on how quickly a system could adapt, how effectively it could implement new technologies, and how well it could respond to changes in global demand. In these areas, a large, centralized structure often faced limitations. As the 1970s approached, the industry stood in a position that appeared strong but was becoming increasingly rigid. It had achieved integration, expanded its workforce, and consolidated its operations into a powerful national system. But that system was also becoming more complex, more dependent on centralized decisions, and less responsive to rapid change. The mechanisms that had enabled its growth were now beginning to constrain its evolution. The British steel industry had succeeded in becoming larger, more organized, and more dominant than at any point in its history. But in doing so, it had also become less flexible at a time when flexibility was becoming essential. The system had grown into a giant, impressive in scale, deeply embedded in the economy, and central to national industry. But it was a giant that could not move quickly. And in a global market that was beginning to accelerate, that limitation would prove critical. Because the British steel industry had become stronger in size, but weaker in its ability to adapt. Chapter 3. The Golden Era: Peak Power and Illusion. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, British steel had reached a level of scale and influence that placed it among the most powerful industrial systems in the world. Annual production ranged between 25 and 28 million tons, positioning Britain as one of the leading global producers. The nationalized system was operating at near full capacity, supplying both domestic industries and international markets. Steel moved out of Britain into Europe, North America, and beyond, supporting construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure projects at a global level. Within the country, its presence was even more dominant. From bridges and buildings to automobiles and ships, steel was embedded in nearly every part of the industrial economy. But the significance of the industry extended beyond production figures. In towns such as Scunthorpe, Port Talbot, and Teesside, steel was not just a source of employment, it was the foundation of daily life. Entire local economies were structured around a single plant, with businesses, housing, and public services all connected to its operation. Work in steel was stable, often long-term, and in many cases passed from one generation to the next. Families built their lives around the industry, creating a continuity that gave the work a deeper meaning beyond income. Steel was not simply something people did, it was something they belonged to. This stability was reinforced by the structure of the nationalized system. Employment conditions were relatively secure, wages were consistent, and the presence of state backing created a widespread belief that the industry would endure. Steel had become too central to the economy to fail, and too integrated into national infrastructure to be easily replaced. That assumption shaped expectations, not only among workers, but across the regions that depended on the industry. The future appeared predictable, and the system appeared permanent. At the industrial level, the scale of operations reinforced that perception. Large integrated plants operated continuously, converting raw materials into finished steel through complex and coordinated processes. Blast furnaces, rolling mills, and finishing lines functioned as part of a system designed for constant output. The visual impact was significant. Industrial skylines illuminated by the glow of molten metal, facilities running without interruption, and a level of activity that suggested ongoing expansion. The industry did not appear to be stabilizing, it appeared to be advancing. Exports further strengthened this position. British steel remained competitive in many international markets, and global demand, while beginning to shift, was still sufficient to absorb large volumes of production. Domestically, key industries such as automotive manufacturing and shipbuilding relied heavily on a consistent supply of steel, creating a network of interdependence that reinforced the system's importance. Steel supported these industries, and in return, they sustained demand for steel. The result was a structure that appeared both interconnected and resilient. However, beneath this surface of strength, underlying imbalances were beginning to form. The infrastructure supporting this level of output was not consistently modern. While some facilities had been upgraded, many continued to operate using older systems that required higher energy input and greater labor intensity. These limitations were not immediately visible in overall production figures, but they affected efficiency. Output remained high, but the cost of maintaining that output was increasing. At the same time, international competitors were moving in a different direction. Countries such as Japan and West Germany were operating newer plants built with efficiency as a primary objective. Their production systems were more streamlined, their energy usage lower, and their output per worker higher. The difference was not always apparent in total production, but it was becoming significant in terms of cost and competitiveness. Britain was maintaining its position through scale, while others were improving theirs through efficiency. This created a gap that was not immediately recognized within the system itself. As long as production remained strong and employment stable, there was little pressure to fundamentally reassess the structure of the industry. The success of previous decades reinforced the belief that the existing model was sufficient. The system had delivered growth, stability, and national importance, and there was no immediate indication that it could not continue to do so. But this perception was shaped by conditions that were already beginning to change. Global demand was becoming less predictable, energy costs were starting to rise, and new producers were entering the market with lower cost structures. The environment that had supported large-scale, high-cost production was shifting, but the system built around those conditions had not yet adjusted. The most significant factor during this period was not what was visible, but what was overlooked. The industry appeared stable because its output remained high, its workforce remained large, and its role within the economy remained central. But stability at the surface masked vulnerability beneath it. The system was functioning, but it was doing so with increasing reliance on conditions that were no longer guaranteed. This is what defined the golden era, not just its strength, but its illusion. It was a period where scale created confidence, where continuity created belief, and where past success shaped expectations about the future. The industry did not appear fragile, it appeared secure, and that perception delayed the recognition of the changes taking place around it. The British steel industry did not enter its decline from a position of weakness. It entered it from a position of maximum strength, at a time when production was high, employment was stable, and its importance seemed unquestioned. And that is what made the moment so critical, because the system was not failing. It was succeeding, but in a world that was already beginning to move beyond it. And within that success, the first real conditions of collapse had already begun to take shape. Chapter 4: Global Shift and Hidden Cracks. The collapse of British steel did not begin with a single decision or a sudden shock. It emerged through a series of global shifts that gradually exposed the limitations of a system built for a different era. The first major disruption came in 1973, when the oil crisis triggered a sharp increase in energy prices across the world. For an industry as energy-intensive as steel, this was not a temporary setback. It was a structural change. Production costs rose immediately, and systems that had once operated within sustainable margins began to feel pressure. For countries with modern, energy-efficient facilities, the impact could be absorbed. For Britain, where much of the infrastructure relied on older, less efficient processes, the effect was significantly more severe. At the same time, global demand for steel began to slow. The rapid expansion that had defined the post-war decades started to stabilize, and large-scale industrial growth across key markets lost momentum. Construction projects declined, manufacturing output softened, and the need for continuous increases in steel production weakened. This shift created a new imbalance, too much steel being produced for a market that no longer required it. Overcapacity became a defining feature of the global industry, and with it came intensified competition. In this new environment, efficiency became the deciding factor. Countries such as Japan and West Germany, having rebuilt their industries with modern infrastructure, were now operating highly optimized production systems. Their plants were designed for lower energy consumption, streamlined workflows, and higher output per worker. This allowed them to produce steel at lower costs while maintaining competitive quality. Britain, by contrast, was still operating many facilities built under earlier industrial conditions. While production levels remained high, the cost of achieving that output was increasing, and the gap between British producers and their international competitors was becoming more pronounced. As competition intensified, price pressure followed. Producers capable of operating at lower costs were able to undercut others, driving global steel prices downward. For British steel, this created a narrowing margin between production costs and selling prices. In some cases, the system was producing steel at costs that approached or exceeded the price it could be sold for. Losses began to emerge not because production had stopped, but because the economic conditions supporting that production had shifted. Domestic factors added further complexity. Labor costs in Britain were relatively high, reflecting both wage structures and the strength of trade unions within the industry. For decades, unions had played a central role in securing stability and fair conditions for workers. But in a more competitive global market, these costs became increasingly difficult to sustain. Attempts to reduce the workforce or restructure operations often faced resistance, creating tension between economic necessity and social responsibility. The system was not only under financial pressure, it was navigating internal conflict over how that pressure should be managed. To maintain stability, the government increased its financial support. Subsidies were used to offset losses, protect employment, and keep production running in plants that were no longer economically competitive under market conditions. In the short term, this approach prevented immediate collapse. Operations continued, workers remained employed, and the industry retained its visible structure. But this stability was artificial. It depended on external support rather than internal efficiency, allowing underlying problems to persist. This is where the deeper structural limitations became unavoidable. The nationalized system, designed for coordination and scale, struggled to respond quickly to changing conditions. Decisions were influenced not only by economic factors, but by political considerations, particularly the social impact of plant closures and job losses. As a result, necessary adjustments were often delayed, and resources were allocated in ways that prioritized short-term stability over long-term competitiveness. At the same time, the scale of the organization limited its ability to adapt. Large centralized systems are effective at maintaining consistency, but they are slower to respond when conditions change rapidly. In the case of British Steel, this meant that modernization efforts did not keep pace with global developments, and opportunities to restructure were not always taken at the moment they were most effective. Globally, the industry continued to evolve. New production methods, including the growing use of electric arc furnaces and more flexible manufacturing systems, allowed producers to operate with lower costs and greater responsiveness to demand. These systems required less capital, could be scaled more efficiently, and reduced dependence on traditional large-scale blast furnace operations. Britain, heavily invested in its existing infrastructure, found it difficult to transition at the same speed. The gap between its system and those of its competitors widened further. By the late 1970s, the situation had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The industry was still producing large volumes of steel, but the economic foundation supporting that production had weakened. Losses were no longer temporary fluctuations, they were becoming a consistent feature of the system. Government support continued to maintain operations, but it also delayed the structural changes that were becoming necessary. What made this phase particularly critical was that the industry had not yet collapsed. Production continued, employment remained high, and the physical infrastructure was still active. But beneath that surface, the system had shifted from operating on its own strength to relying on external support. It was no longer competitive in the way it had once been, it was being sustained. This created a form of stability that was inherently fragile. As long as financial support continued, the system could function. But without addressing its underlying inefficiencies, that support could not continue indefinitely. The longer the industry relied on it, the more difficult the eventual adjustment would become. The British steel industry had entered a phase where survival was no longer determined by performance, but by intervention. It was still active, still producing, and still employing thousands, but it was no longer sustaining itself through its own competitiveness. And that is what defined this moment, because the system had not yet failed, but it was no longer standing on its own. It was operating, but only because it was being held in place. And that meant the industry was no longer stable. It was surviving, but only through artificial support. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. Late 1970s. Crisis. By the end of the 1970s, the pressures that had been building within the British steel industry could no longer be contained. What had once been a manageable imbalance, rising costs, slowing demand, and declining efficiency, had evolved into a full-scale financial crisis. The scale of the losses made this impossible to ignore. British Steel was losing money at a rate that, in today's terms, exceeded £1 billion annually, and these were not temporary fluctuations. They sustained losses across a system that continued to operate at high capacity but no longer generated viable returns. At the same time, global demand for steel continued to weaken. The economic slowdown that followed the oil crisis deepened into a broader recession, and between 1979 and 1981, industrial output declined sharply across major economies. Construction projects were delayed or cancelled, manufacturing slowed, and demand for steel contracted. The global market, already saturated, became even more competitive as producers attempted to maintain output in the face of declining demand. Prices fell further, compressing margins to the point where profitability became increasingly difficult for high-cost producers. For Britain, this created a structural problem. The industry had been built for scale, designed to operate continuously and produce large volumes. Reducing output was not a simple adjustment. It meant disrupting integrated systems, idling facilities, and potentially shutting down plants that supported entire regions. But continuing production at the same level only increased losses. The system was caught in a position where neither option provided a clear path forward. This is where government pressure intensified. The financial burden of sustaining the industry had reached levels that were becoming politically and economically unsustainable. Public funds were being used to offset losses, and as those losses grew, so did the urgency to act. The objective began to shift, from maintaining employment at all costs to restoring economic viability. The question was no longer whether change was necessary, but how far it would go. The most immediate solution was cost reduction. And in an industry where labor represented a major component of operating costs, that meant reducing the workforce. On paper, the logic was straightforward. In reality, it triggered one of the most difficult phases in the industry's history. The workforce was not just large, it was organized, experienced, and deeply connected to the industry it sustained. Trade unions had long played a central role in shaping working conditions, wages, and job security. For decades, this relationship had contributed to stability. Now it has become a point of conflict. Proposals for job cuts and restructuring were met with resistance, as workers faced the prospect of losing not just employment, but the economic foundation of their communities. Strikes and disputes followed, but they did not alter the underlying reality. The financial position of the industry continued to deteriorate, and the pressure to reduce costs did not ease. The conflict between unions and government highlighted a deeper issue. There was no solution that could preserve both the existing scale of employment and the long-term viability of the system. One had to give way to the other. At the same time, the broader perception of the industry was beginning to change. For decades, British steel had been viewed as a pillar of strength, an essential part of the national economy that justified continued support. Now, it was increasingly seen as a liability, an operation that consumed resources without producing sustainable returns. The narrative shifted from preservation to justification. Instead of asking how to protect the industry, policymakers began asking how much of it could realistically be maintained. This shift marked a turning point. The issue was no longer whether the system was under pressure, it was whether it could continue in its existing form at all. The conditions that had supported its growth, strong demand, limited competition, and tolerance for inefficiency, had disappeared. What remained was a system that had to adjust rapidly or face collapse. The defining realization of this moment was simple, but decisive. The industry was no longer aligned with its own cost structure. It was producing at a scale that could not be sustained under prevailing market conditions. It was no longer a driver of growth. It had become a burden. This recognition reframed the entire crisis. Decisions that had once seemed unthinkable, large-scale layoffs, plant closures, and structural downsizing were no longer seen as extreme measures, but as necessary steps. The focus shifted from maintaining the system as it existed to determining what could be preserved within a smaller, more sustainable framework. But this transition carried consequences that extended beyond economic calculations. Every reduction in cost translated into a loss of employment, and every closure affected communities built around the assumption of long-term stability. The scale of the industry meant that these impacts were not isolated. They were widespread, affecting regions that had few alternative sources of economic activity. By the early 1980s, the British steel industry had reached a point where continuation in its existing form was no longer possible. The losses were too large, the global environment too competitive, and the internal pressures too intense. The system had to change, but that change required decisions that would fundamentally reshape its structure. There was no longer a scenario in which both scale and stability could be preserved. No longer a path that allowed the industry to remain as it had been. The crisis had forced a choice, not between success and failure, but between preserving jobs or preserving the industry itself. Chapter 6. The Collapse, 1980s to 1990s. By the early 1980s, the crisis within the British steel industry had reached a point where it could no longer be managed through gradual adjustments or temporary support. The losses were no longer cyclical, they were structural, and the system that had once sustained Britain's industrial power was now operating under conditions it could not survive. At the same time, the political environment in Britain was shifting. When Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, her government introduced a fundamentally different economic approach, one that rejected long-term subsidies for loss-making state industries and prioritized efficiency, profitability, and market discipline. Steel was no longer treated as an untouchable national asset. It was expected to justify itself economically or be reduced. What followed was not a slow reform, but a decisive restructuring. The British Steel Corporation was forced to confront the gap between its cost structure and global market realities, and the most immediate response was a dramatic reduction in workforce and capacity. Employment, which had once exceeded 300,000 workers, was cut aggressively over the decade, falling to well below 100,000. These were not gradual reductions, they were concentrated and disruptive, often tied to the closure or downsizing of entire plants. Jobs that had once been seen as stable and long-term disappeared within a few years, leaving thousands without clear alternatives in regions where industrial employment was already declining. At the same time, the physical structure of the industry began to contract. Plants that had operated continuously for decades were assessed purely on economic performance, not historical importance. Those that could not compete under global cost conditions were closed. The process itself was controlled but irreversible. Production slowed, furnaces were shut down, and facilities that had once defined entire regions moved towards silence. The industrial landscapes that had been shaped by constant activity began to change, as the visible signs of production were gradually removed. Among these closures, the shutdown of Ravenscraig in 1992 became one of the defining moments of the entire collapse. Once one of Europe's largest steelworks, Ravenscraig had been a central pillar of British steel production, employing thousands and supporting a wider regional economy. Its closure was not just another reduction, it was symbolic. If a plant of that scale and importance could no longer be sustained, it confirmed that the conditions supporting Britain's industrial model had fundamentally changed. The system was no longer being adjusted, it was being reduced. The human impact of this transformation was immediate and widespread. In regions built around steel production, the loss of a major plant meant more than unemployment. It disrupted entire local economies. Businesses that had depended on steelworkers lost their customer base, secondary industries connected to production declined, and communities that had developed around a shared industrial identity were forced into uncertainty. The generational continuity that had defined steelworking life, where skills and roles passed from one generation to the next, was broken. For many, the loss was not only economic, but structural, affecting how communities functioned and how individuals understood their place within them. This process unfolded alongside continued changes in the global market. As Britain reduced its capacity, producers in other regions, particularly in Asia, expanded. With lower labor costs and newer infrastructure, these producers were able to supply steel at prices that British plants struggled to match. The competitive pressure that had been building since the 1970s intensified further, reinforcing the shift toward a smaller, more cost-focused industry in Britain. The global system no longer required Britain to produce steel at the scale it once had, and the industry was forced to adjust accordingly. Privatization marked the final stage of this transformation. In 1988, British Steel was returned to the private sector, ending its period as a nationalized entity and formalizing the shift toward a market-driven model. By this point, the industry had already been significantly reduced in size, and the transition to private ownership reflected a new objective, not expansion, but sustainability within global competition. The company that emerged was more efficient, more focused, and better aligned with market conditions, but it was also fundamentally different from the system that had existed at its peak. What makes this phase particularly significant is that the industry did not collapse in a single, visible moment. Instead, it underwent a controlled contraction, shaped by economic pressure and policy decisions. The goal was not to eliminate steel production entirely, but to reduce it to a level that could survive without continuous financial support. In that sense, the collapse was not defined by disappearance, but by transformation, from a large, state-supported system to a smaller, market-driven one. However, this transformation came at a cost that extended beyond efficiency. The industry that emerged no longer held the same position within British society. It was no longer the dominant employer across multiple regions, no longer the central force shaping industrial identity, and no longer the unquestioned backbone of the national economy. Steel remained part of the system, but it no longer defined it. The physical and social landscape reflected this change. Areas once defined by industrial activity were left with reduced operations, altered infrastructure, and fewer opportunities. Communities were forced to adapt to a new reality, often without immediate alternatives. The transition varied across regions, but the overall direction was clear. The era of large-scale industrial dominance had ended. By the early 1990s, the restructuring was complete. The industry still existed, and in many ways it was more economically viable than it had been during its period of heavy losses. But that viability had come through reduction. The system that had once represented scale, strength, and national identity had been reshaped into something smaller, more controlled, and more limited in its reach. The British steel industry did not disappear. It survived, but it survived in a form that no longer resembled what it had once been. The scale was reduced, the workforce diminished, and the role it played within the economy fundamentally altered. What remained was a system capable of operating within global constraints, but no longer capable of defining them. And that is the real outcome of this collapse. The industry was not destroyed. It was restructured, reduced, and made efficient. But in the process of saving it, Britain lost the version of steel that had once defined an entire nation. The industry endured, but its identity did not. Chapter 7. Aftermath. The ghost of an industry. By the early 2000s, the British steel industry had entered a phase that was no longer defined by growth or collapse, but by adaptation within a system it no longer controlled. The centralized structure that had once defined its strength had dissolved, replaced by a fragmented network shaped by global ownership, shifting investment priorities, and international market forces. The transformation began in 1999 when British Steel merged with the Dutch company Koninklijke Hoogovens to form Chorus, marking a transition from a national industrial system to a multinational operation. Production continued across key UK sites, but the industry was no longer driven by domestic priorities. It was integrated into a broader global structure where decisions were influenced by international competition and cost efficiency. This shift became more pronounced in 2007 when Chorus was acquired by Tata Steel in a deal worth approximately £6.2 billion. The acquisition reflected a reversal in industrial dynamics. An industry that had once projected British power globally was now being sustained through foreign investment. Under Tata Steel, UK operations remained active, but they were evaluated within a larger international portfolio. Decisions about production, investment, and long-term viability were no longer centered solely on Britain. They were measured against global benchmarks where cost, efficiency, and return determined survival. At the same time, the global steel market was undergoing a structural shift. The rapid expansion of production in Asia, particularly in China, reshaped the competitive landscape. By the 2010s, China had become the dominant force in global steel manufacturing, producing more than half of the world's supply and exporting surplus steel at prices that were difficult for higher-cost producers to match. This influx of low-cost steel intensified pressure across international markets, placing industries like Britain's in a position where maintaining competitiveness required continuous adjustment. These pressures became visible through a series of crises that highlighted how fragile the system had become. In 2016, Tata Steel announced its intention to sell its UK operations after sustained losses, raising immediate concerns about the future of major plants such as Port Talbot. The potential closure of these facilities was not a distant scenario. It was an immediate risk that threatened thousands of jobs and the stability of entire regions. Government intervention and restructuring efforts prevented a complete shutdown, but the situation made one thing clear. The industry's survival was no longer guaranteed by its historical importance. A similar crisis unfolded in 2019 when British Steel, operating under new ownership after being separated from Tata, entered insolvency following a failure to secure sufficient financial support. The collapse into administration placed thousands of workers at risk and required urgent intervention to maintain operations. Parts of the business were eventually acquired, allowing production to continue, but the pattern was consistent. Stability was temporary, and survival depended on external decisions rather than internal strength. By this stage, the scale of the industry had been significantly reduced. The workforce had declined to fewer than 30,000 workers across the UK steel sector, a fraction of its former size. This contraction reshaped not only the industry but the regions that had depended on it. In many former steel towns, the effects of earlier closures continued to define economic conditions. Employment opportunities were more limited, investment was uneven, and the transition away from heavy industry remained incomplete. While some areas adapted, others continued to experience the long-term consequences of industrial decline. The physical landscape reflected this transformation. Sites that had once operated at full capacity were repurposed, partially dismantled, or left as remnants of a previous industrial era. In some cases, redevelopment introduced new forms of economic activity, but these rarely matched the scale of what had existed before. Large steel plants had supported entire ecosystems of employment, and their absence created gaps that were difficult to replace. For the facilities that remained operational, the reality was one of continuous uncertainty. Plants such as Port Talbot continued to produce steel, but their future depended on factors beyond local control: global demand, investment decisions, regulatory pressures, and cost competitiveness. The industry was no longer expanding. It was maintaining its position within a system that demanded constant efficiency. At a national level, the transformation was definitive. Britain remained part of the global steel industry, but its role had shifted. It no longer operated at a scale that defined international markets, and its influence had been replaced by participation within a broader system shaped by larger, lower-cost producers. And yet, despite this reduction, the industry did not disappear. Steel continued to be produced, workers continued to operate within the remaining plants, and the legacy of more than a century of industrial development remained embedded within the system. But what existed now was fundamentally different from what had come before. The industry had adapted enough to survive, but not enough to reclaim its former position. What remained was a quieter, smaller version of British Steel, one that continued to function, but under conditions that required constant adjustment. Its future was no longer assumed. It depended on decisions made beyond its control, shaped by a global market that had moved far beyond the system it was built for. This is what defines the aftermath of British Steel. Not disappearance, but survival in a diminished form. The industry continues to exist, to produce, and to employ, but it no longer holds the position it once did. Survival continues, but dominance is gone. Chapter 8: Legacy and Meaning. What was lost? The story of British Steel does not end with plant closures or reduced production figures. It extends into the broader transformation of Britain itself. For more than a century, steel had been more than an industry. It was a symbol of industrial power, a material expression of Britain's ability to build, produce, and project influence across the world. It shaped cities, defined regions, and supported entire communities whose identities were built around production. The rise of British Steel was inseparable from the rise of industrial Britain, and its decline marked not just an economic shift, but the end of a system that had once defined how the nation functioned. As the industry contracted in the late 20th century, Britain moved toward a different economic model. Heavy industry gave way to services, finance, and technology-driven sectors that required different skills, different infrastructure, and far fewer workers. This transition reflected a wider global trend, but within Britain, the contrast was particularly visible. Industries that had once employed hundreds of thousands were reduced or restructured, while new sectors emerged that were less tied to physical production and more dependent on information, capital, and global networks. Within this new system, steel did not disappear, but it lost its central position. It remained necessary for construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure, but it was no longer a defining force within the economy. Production could be sourced globally, and competitive advantage shifted toward efficiency, cost control, and technological integration rather than scale alone. The factors that had once made Britain dominant, early industrialization, access to resources, and accumulated expertise, were no longer enough in a global market shaped by rapid change and intense competition. Automation reinforced this shift. Advances in production technology reduced the need for large workforces, allowing steel to be produced with fewer people and greater precision. While this improved efficiency, it also reduced the role of the industry as a source of widespread employment. Steel was no longer the foundation of working-class stability in the way it had been during its peak. It became a smaller, more specialized sector within a diversified economy. What was lost, however, cannot be measured only in output or employment. The decline of British steel also marked the erosion of a particular kind of industrial identity. For decades, communities had been built around the routines, expectations, and shared purpose created by steel production. When that system was reduced, those identities did not disappear immediately, but they became disconnected from the structures that had sustained them. The transition to a new economic model created opportunities, but it also left gaps that were not easily filled. This is what gives the story of British steel its broader meaning. It is not only a case of industrial decline, but an example of how systems that achieve dominance under one set of conditions can struggle when those conditions change. The same qualities that once defined strength, scale, structure, and continuity can become limitations when adaptability becomes more important. In the case of British steel, the response to change was delayed, and by the time adjustments were made, the global environment had already shifted. The lesson is not simply that industries fail, but that they become vulnerable when they rely on past success to navigate future challenges. Warning signs often appear gradually, changes in competition, technology, and cost structures, but they are not always acted upon in time. When the system finally adjusts, it does so under pressure, and the outcome is shaped as much by what was delayed as by what was done. At the same time, the decline of British steel cannot be understood in isolation. It was part of a wider transformation in which globalization redistributed production, technological progress redefined efficiency, and economic priorities shifted towards sectors that offered higher returns. The industry did not collapse in a vacuum. It changed within a world that had moved beyond the conditions that once supported it. What remains today is a legacy that exists in both physical and structural form. Former industrial sites, adapted or abandoned, mark the presence of what once was, while the economic systems that replaced steel reflect the direction in which Britain has moved. The industry still exists, but it no longer defines the nation in the way it once did. And that is the final meaning of this story. The collapse of British steel was not just the loss of an industry, it was the end of a particular way of organizing economic life. It marked the transition from a system built on large-scale production and industrial labor to one defined by flexibility, global integration, and technological change. Industrial systems do not disappear in a single moment. They evolve, adapt, or decline over time, often gradually until the conditions that once sustained them no longer exist. The British steel industry did not vanish, but the version of it that once stood at the center of national power did. And in that transformation lies a broader truth. The strongest industries are not the ones that grow the largest, but the ones that adapt the fastest. Because when the world changes, those that fail to move with it are not destroyed instantly. They fade slowly until they are no longer needed.